Hi there, this is John Spritzler in Boston, providing some words about egalitarianism. I'm the editor of pdrboston.org, which is the egalitarian revolutionary website, and I hope that you will become more interested in what egalitarianism is and how we can win it with an egalitarian revolution. And we'll visit that website, and I hope that you will buy my books that I recently published that deals with this question. One of them is called No Rich and No Poor, and the other is called Divide and Rule, which is about how we can overcome the divisions between the, quote, left and right in the United States that the ruling class deliberately foments to make sure that we are too busy each of us viewing the other half of us as of the have-not population as morally despicable or dangerous to let have real power and so forth. That's how the ruling class stays in power. But I'd like to talk now about another way that the ruling elites have stayed in power historically, and how we need to overcome that problem. And this relates to the one of the main principles of egalitarianism, which is that in the government in egalitarian societies is based on local assemblies of egalitarians having sovereignty. In other words, there is no higher body of government that has lawmaking powers above the local assembly of egalitarians. So, as I've said in other videos, when I say local community, local assembly, a local community is one that is small enough in size so that it is realistically possible for all the egalitarians in that local community who want to participate in the meeting of the local assembly to do so. So just to reiterate some points made in earlier videos, an egalitarian is a person who supports the principle of equality in the sense of no rich and no poor. In economic terms, it means from each according to ability to each according to need, as spelled out more elaborately in other videos. And it also, the second principle of egalitarianism is mutual aid, meaning that people should help each other, not be pitted against each other in competition to make us more easily controllable by some ruling elite, which is the way it is today. In most communities, the vast majority of people hold to these egalitarian principles, and that means that they are egalitarians, even if they've never heard the word before. And so the principle of government in an egalitarian society is that local assemblies open to all the egalitarians in the local community are the sovereign authority. They're the highest body of government that can write laws that the people in that local community have to obey. There's no central government above them that can write a law that people have to obey. And so the question is, why is this a good idea? Well, let me first introduce a phrase to help in discussing this idea. The contrary idea that we are so used to that we take it for granted without even really thinking about it is what I call the authoritarian principle. The authoritarian principle is the idea that if a government is legitimate, and legitimacy can be derived different ways in different times and places. In the United States, the government obtains its legitimacy in the eyes of the public by virtue of the election process. It claims to be the fairly elected representatives of the people. So the authoritarian principle says that if the government is legitimate, then you have to obey the highest level of government, what I'll refer to generically as the central government, typically the national level government. Although if we have world government, it would be, the world government. In Europe, they have something which is higher than the national level with the euro. In Brussels, the euro, whatever it's called, government. In either event, the authoritarian principle says that if the government's legitimate, you must obey the highest level of government, the central governmental body. Whether you agree with it or not, that's the authoritarian principle. You have to obey it. So I'd like to just point out that this principle, which is widely accepted, is essentially a welcome mat laid out for any would-be dominating oppressive elite to control the entire population. And we know that's happened in the United States. Big money, with its lobbyists, has essentially taken control of the few hundred people that constitute the federal government, the congressmen, congresswomen, people in the executive branch. Big money can do this because it can bribe individuals. It can offer them cushy jobs after they serve the bidding of big money in their office when they retire. It can do other things too. It can, corporations can threaten to leave unless the politicians do what the corporations tell them to. We know that almost all the regulators in the federal government are essentially representatives of the big money interests in the industries that they are presumably regulating. So the fact of the matter is that our present society demonstrates all too clearly that a small upper class of very wealthy people can gain control over the several hundred people, which is a relatively small number of individuals that constitute a central government. And once they gain that control, then they have gained control of more than 300 million people in the United States, because those 300 million people in the United States go along with, accept the authoritarian principle that if the federal government passes a law, you've got to obey it, whether you like it or not. And this is how big money is able to get its way at the expense of hundreds of millions of people in the United States. To take another example, let's look at the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. I made another video about how egalitarianism is fundamentally different from communism, and one of the main points is that the Marxist theory requires Marxists, when they gain power, to set up a dictatorship of the Marxists over the rest of the population, because the Marxists view ordinary people as just thinking with their belly and having no subjective desire to make the kind of classless society that communists envision in the far distant future, after they have remolded everybody with social engineering to change them from the bad, selfish people that they are today, supposedly, into the good kind of people who will make possible a classless society. Che Guevara expressed this with his famous claim that the Communist Party in Cuba had to create a new socialist man and socialist woman in order for them to have a good society, because the currently existing men and women in Cuba just were not good enough. Okay, so the communists need to set themselves up as a dictatorship over ordinary people. That was what my previous video was about. But the question I want to address here is, how did they get away with it? How did the Bolshevik Party, it was a very small party at the time of the revolution, how did it get into the position for about 70 years, I guess, of being this like totalitarian dictatorship? You know, where Stalin, at his whim, could have people sent to the gulags and so on. Well, the answer, I think, is that the Russian population, for centuries, was used to the idea of the authoritarian principle. The authority was the Tsar for most of those centuries, of course, and the idea that you had to obey the central government was one that was firmly established. And so when the Bolsheviks seized control of the central government with essentially a coup against the Kerensky government that had replaced the Tsar earlier in 1917, so in October of 1917, the Bolsheviks, with the support of enough soldiers, just kicked the Kerensky regime out and said, "We're the government." And they're pretty brutally dictatorial. There was a Constituent Assembly that was in the process of being elected from the previous government. Even from the Tsar, actually, had agreed to this, and the machinery of electing delegates, was underway before the Bolsheviks took power, and the Bolsheviks tried to make sure that they would have a majority of the delegates be Bolshevik Party members, but they failed, and so they knew that the Constituent Assembly, when it was going to meet, was not going to be pro-Bolshevik, so they disbanded the assembly violently. They just disbanded it, and they set themselves up as the central power. And then their legitimacy. It's an interesting question. What was the basis of their legitimacy? For some people, the basis of legitimacy of the Bolshevik Party was their claim that they understood the science of Marxism-Leninism better than anybody else, and that they understood how to hasten the impersonal laws of social development that Marx's so-called bogus science is all about, and that only they understood how to ultimately make Russia a classless society. Well, a lot of people believe that, and were willing to accord legitimacy to Lenin and the Bolsheviks. And to a certain extent, the Bolsheviks used fear of counter-revolution, which there really was the threat of counter-revolution, and they claimed that they were the only ones that could successfully prevent a counter-revolution of pro-Tsarist generals and so forth. So they had ways of gaining legitimacy, but the point is, once they had legitimacy, people felt they had to obey the Bolshevik Party no matter what, and for many years that happened. Now, if we are going to try to have genuine democracy, we have to reject the authoritarian principle explicitly and clearly, because otherwise we're going to find ourselves feeling that we have to obey some handful of central government people, ministers or congressmen or what have you, who are controlled by people who want to dominate and oppress us, and that's absurd. Now, even though the authoritarian principle has been so widely accepted, it has not been always universally widely accepted. I'll give you some examples that are in my book. So let me just read a paragraph or two from my book. In England in the 1640s, there was a revolutionary movement known as the Levellers that aimed to abolish monarchy and the House of Lords. There was also a popular and anti-monarchist army called the New Model Army that was strongly influenced by Leveller ideas. And now I'm quoting from Murray Bookchin's book, History of this Period. Quote, they expressly opposed blind obedience to unjust civil law. And then a quote inside the quote, I confess to me this principle of obedience is very dangerous, unquote, declared John Wildman, one of the civilian levelers. He says, Wildman says, it is contrary to what the Army first declared in the June 14th Declaration, that they stood upon such principles of right and freedom and the laws of nature and nations, whereby men were to preserve themselves, though the persons to whom authority belonged should fail in it. So this is a clear rejection of the authoritarian principle in the mass movement whose main leader was Oliver Cromwell, and which beheaded King Charles in 1649, I think it was, in England. And I'll give one other example. In France, at the outbreak of the revolution in 1789, after people in the streets of Paris stormed the Royal Bastille prison and took it over, similar events took place throughout the nation. And again, I'm quoting from Murray Bookchin's history of this. Quote, when existing municipal corporations failed to meet the townspeople's demands for price controls on food, they would invade the Hotel de Ville, which is the city hall, and forcibly expel the old authorities, replacing traditional institutions and their office holders with more democratic forms and personnel. Once again, the unreliability of the army made these changes possible. At Strasbourg, for example, royal troops looked on passively as the Hotel de Ville was sacked by demonstrators. By such various means did the vast local officialdom of the ancient regime, from the loftiest intendant to the lowliest bureaucrat, withdraw from the places they had occupied, causing the collapse of the central authority. Effectively, this is the key sentence here, effectively, France was now decentralized. The new municipal governments agreed to accept the decisions of the Assembly, i.e. the central governmental body, but only with the proviso that those decisions accorded with the wishes of the local population, which essentially means that the local population is sovereign, not the central authority claiming to be above them. And what that also means implicitly is that the role of the central government was perceived to be one of proposing proposals to be implemented by all or many of the local municipalities. And if the local municipalities agreed with the proposal, then they would implement it. But if they didn't agree, they would not. And that's voluntary federation, the principle that I'm advocating, which is the opposite of the authoritarian principle that you have to obey the central authority no matter what. So I'd like to end by discussing the related question of that people ask about what I'm proposing, which is this. People say, well, what if a local assembly somewhere in some local community decides to do something very, very bad? For instance, what if they decide to make slaves of this or that race or ethnicity of people? In other words, what if they decide to do something which is in egregious violation of egalitarian principles? Does the fact of local sovereignty mean they have a right to do it? And the answer is no. The principle of egalitarianism is that the sovereign authorities are local assemblies of egalitarians, not of everybody. In most communities, the egalitarians are the vast majority, but maybe in Beverly Hills they're not. I don't know. If a community does something, no matter how, quote, democratically, that is totally anti-egalitarian, then the other local communities, local assemblies of egalitarians, have every right to decide that the people in that community doing the bad thing, they are not egalitarians, even if they might claim to be. And the whole idea of egalitarian revolution is that egalitarians have a perfect right to remove from power the anti-egalitarians, the rich, in short, who are the main place where the anti-egalitarians can be found. And local assemblies have every right in the world to use voluntary federation to mutually agree to create a militia, to do whatever is necessary, use whatever force and violence if necessary, to remove from power any people in any other part of the world that are egregiously carrying out anti-egalitarian acts. And so this principle of local power belonging to the local assembly of egalitarians does not mean that any local assembly can do anything, no matter how terrible. And the other point is that what I'm advocating has nothing whatsoever to do with any denial of the need for large-scale coordination and cooperation. As I point out in my book, voluntary federation has been used to create global cooperation with the International Postal Service. It's been used to create national cooperation among all the teams in the National Football League. And I don't think people have been complaining about their packages not getting delivered to other countries, or that when they go to see a football game that it's all chaos. That's not the case. In my book, I quote from the anarchist writer Kropotkin, who was writing in the 1800s and who described how voluntary federation was what produced the incredibly efficient railroad system that covered the entire Eurasian continent, and that made it possible for passengers and packages to be delivered rather seamlessly across hundreds of different railroad companies and national borders. So if we want to avoid being dominated by an oppressive elite, we need to reject the principle that lets them dominate us, and that's the authoritarian principle. And that's why the highest lawmaking body in any local community should be the local assembly of egalitarians, at which all the egalitarians in that community are invited to participate as equals in the writing of the laws that they and others in the community will have to obey. Thank you very much, and I hope you will continue watching these the videos in this series, because it's about helping us come up with a shared vision of what we want, so that we know what we're fighting for and can actually win it, because with no vision, there's no victory. Thank you. Goodbye.